Hi, welcome to Crisco's Corner. Proud to live in the greatest country in the world. Unfiltered opinions, no PC discussion here. Agree, disagree, hate it, love it, it's all good. Sit back and enjoy some unfiltered commentary. We discuss politics, culture, interviews, and more. Your comments are always welcome. Please help the channel by hitting that subscribe button. Doesn't cost a thing. And as always, thanks for your support. Hi, folks. Welcome back to Crisco's Corner. I thought this would be interesting as it's very timely as well. People think that politics today is dirty and rotten and the terrible commercials you see and the bombastic stuff that Trump says and the ridiculous things that Biden say about the Republicans will put you all back in chains and some of the crazy stuff on both sides. You know, one makes out the other one to be a monster, and then one side says the other side's a bigger monster. One side says the guy's stupid, and one guy says, no, he's even dumber. And back and forth, and all their surrogates and pundits and blah, 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 blah. Because back in the old days, presidents didn't campaign themselves directly. They saw it as beneath them. So it was up until the 20th century that things started to change. But this is about the Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams feud / debacle / whatever. In the beginning, the first election between the two was in 1824. And people think that this campaign was dirty as well and fought hard. And somebody's trying to finagle and bend the rules, and one person really won, and the other one said they cheated, and the other one said they used the F word. You can't. Not the F word we're normally used to, with a different new F word now, the F-R-A-U-D word. Can't say on YouTube now, and it's so ridiculous. It's so childish that we have to play these little games to get your videos put up on a social media platform, but that's the way it is. But anyway, I digress. This was particularly bad and vicious. I mean, some of the, not only do they dislike each other, they hate each other's guts is probably an understatement. But let's start with the election of 1824, also dubbed as the Krupp bargain. The presidential election of 1824, which involved three major figures in American history, was decided in the House of Representatives. One man won, one man helped win, and was stormed out of Washington, D.C., denouncing the affair as the Krupp bargain. Until the disputed election of 2000, this was the most controversial election in American history. Now, it says updated September 2019, so up until 2000, the most controversial election. I might change that now. But anyway, I think this is more similar to Trump, Biden, Jackson, Adams because of the fact of the personalities involved. Trump is very much personality-wise like Jackson. Brash, says things, just lashes out, and he's just, and he's very much a populist. He was very popular among the people. Now, this is the first time, I believe, either this election or the next one, where the state legislatures did not pick the electors. It went by popular vote. But anyway, in the 1820s, the United States was in a relatively settled period. The War of 1812 was fading into memory, and the Missouri Compromise in 1821 had put aside the contentious issue of the enslavement of black people, where it would essentially remain until the 1850s. A pattern of two-term presidents had developed in the early 1800s. Actually, that's only partially true. George Washington had 2 terms. John Adams got screwed over by one of his best friends, Thomas Jefferson. They later reconciled and had a long, long friendship. I haven't read all the letters between John Adams and Jefferson, but I hear they're really, really something. If you can get a hold of them online, they're probably worth reading. I've read a couple, but then Jefferson had 2 terms as the 3rd president. Madison, probably the smartest of the group by far, of the presidents anyway, went 2 terms. And James Monroe was elected in 1816 and 1820, 2 terms as well. James Monroe, by the way, was the last of the founding fathers that was president. As Monroe's 2nd term reached its final year, several major candidates were intent on running in 1824. John Quincy Adams, the son of the 2nd president, had served as Secretary of State in the James Monroe administration since 1817. Being Secretary of State was considered one obvious path to the presidency. Well, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry. We can go through the list. That's actually still partially true. As Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe had all previously held the position. Adams, by his own admission, was considered to have an unexciting personality. Well, that sounds familiar. Oh, boy, a lot of similarities here. As my grandmother, rest her soul, used to say, got the personality of an egg. But his long career in public service made him well qualified to be chief executive. Long career in public service. Boy, this is starting looking the same. I do have to say, though, in all fairness, John Quincy Adams is way, way, way smarter than Joe Biden. Sorry, Joe, but it's just true. Andrew Jackson. Following his victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, General Jackson became a larger-than-life American hero. He was elected as a senator from Tennessee in 1823 and immediately began positioning himself to run for president. The main concerns people had about Jackson were he was self-educated and possessed a fiery temperament. He had killed men in duels and had been wounded by gunfire in various confrontations. If not mistaken, I don't know if he was president or not, but somebody tried to take a pot shot at him and kill him, and he missed. And Jackson has pounded the crap out of him with his cane. In all fairness, somebody's going to shoot at me, I'd pound his ass too. Henry Clay is the 3rd in this little story. He was Speaker of the House. Clay was a dominating political figure. He had pushed the Missouri Compromise through Congress, and that landmark legislation had, for at least a time, settled the issue of slavery. It just kicked the can down the road. We all know how that turned out. Clay had an advantage. If several candidates ran and none of them received the majority of the votes from Electoral College, that would put the decision in the House of Representatives, where Clay yielded great power. An election decided in the House would be unlikely in the modern era. And it almost came to be. But Americans in the 1820s didn't consider it outlandish, as it had happened recently. The election of 1800, which is won by Jefferson, had been decided in the House of Representatives, after stabbing his good friend John Adams in the back. William Crawford, though mostly forgotten today, George Crawford was a powerful political figure, having served as a senator and secretary of the Treasury under Madison. He was considered a strong candidate for president, but had suffered a stroke in 1823 that rendered him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. Despite that, some politicians still supported his candidacy. On election day in that area, candidates didn't campaign for themselves. Campaigning was left to managers and surrogates. And throughout the year, various partisans spoke and wrote in favor of the candidates. When the votes were tallied from across the nation, Jackson had won a plurality of the popular as well as electoral vote. In the Electoral College tabulations, Adams came in 2nd, Crawford 3rd, Clay 4th. While Jackson won the popular vote that was counted, some states at the time picked electors in the state legislature and really didn't tally a popular vote for president. The U.S. Constitution dictates that a candidate needs to win a majority of the Electoral College, and no one had met that standard. Today, it's 270. The election, therefore, had to be decided by the House of Representatives. The man who had an advantage in that venue, House Speaker Clay, was automatically eliminated. The Constitution said only the top 3 candidates could be considered. In January 1824, Adams had invited Clay to visit him at his residence, and the two men spoke for several hours. It is unknown whether they had reached some sort of deal, but suspicions were widespread. Oh boy, how'd you like to be a little mouse, a little fly on the wall, there and that? I would love to see the transcript of that. History geeks like myself like weird stuff like that. That must have been fascinating conversation. In February 1825, the House held its election, in which each state delegation got one vote. Of course, that's the Constitution. It almost came down to that for this one, but it didn't. Clay had made it known that he supported Adams, and thanks to his influence, Adams won the vote and was elected president. Jackson, already famous for his temper, was furious. I would be too. You had both the popular and the electoral votes. That's a legitimate thing to stand on. When Adams named Clay as his Secretary of State, Jackson denounced the election as the corrupt bargain. Many assumed Clay had sold his influence to Adams so he could be Secretary of State and increase his chance of being president someday. Jackson was so angry about what he considered Washington manipulations that he resigned his Senate seat, returned to Tennessee, and began planning the campaign that would make him president 4 years later. The 1928 campaign between Jackson and Adams was perhaps the dirtiest campaign ever, with wild accusations thrown about on each side. Does it sound familiar? Jackson was elected. He would serve 2 terms as president and began the era of strong political parties in America. As for Adams, after losing Jackson in 1828, he retired briefly to Massachusetts before running successfully for the House of Representatives in 1830. He served 17 years in Congress, becoming a strong advocate against the enslavement of African Americans. Adams always said being a congressman was more gratifying than being president. He died in the U.S. Capitol, having suffered a stroke in the building in February 1848. Clay ran for president again, losing to Jackson in 1832. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Clay. And James Knox Polk in 1844. Well, he never gained the nation's highest office. He remained a major figure in national politics until his death in 1852. Now, we're going to switch over here to 4 years later. The election of 1828 was marked by dirty tactics. Here's the background. You got a little bit. Jackson's pissed. He feels he got cheated by the Washington insiders. This sound familiar? There's a lot of similarities here, folks. Adams, a many year work inside government and basically what we call the swamp today. And Jackson, an outsider, a populist who felt he got screwed over. This sounds familiar. The election of 1828 was marked by dirty tactics. The campaign that elected Andrew Jackson president was brutal, and it was. The election of 1828 was significant as it heralded a profound change with the election of a man widely viewed as a champion of the common people. Boy, this sounds familiar. But that year's campaigning was also noteworthy for the intense personal attacks loudly employed by the supporters of both candidates. We could just switch the names around and probably still fit. The incumbent John Quincy Adams and the challenger Andrew Jackson could not have been more different. Adams was a highly educated son of the nation's second president and had traveled widely as a diplomat. Jackson was an orphan who clawed his way to success along the frontier before becoming a national hero at the Battle of New Orleans. In other words, he was a self-made man. Even though Trump got some loans when he was young from his father, he had hard times, and he crawled his way back. The guy's a fighter. Both similar personalities. While Jackson was known for thoughtful introspection, well, Joe's not that smart, but Jackson had a reputation for violent encounters and duels. Perhaps the one thing they had in common was they both had long careers of public service. And by the time the votes were cast, both men would have wild stories circulated about their past with lurid charges of murder, adultery, procuring of women being plastered across the pages of partisan newspapers. Now, you think I'm a big critic of CNN, MSNBC, all the lamestream media, as they call them now, being so partisan and so hateful. Honestly, of course, there wasn't TV back then, but newspapers and magazines, mostly newspapers, were owned by individual publishers, and they didn't give a damn about being unbiased. They made it clear from the beginning, I hate this one and I love this guy. And they just pounded the other one. It was dirty, 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 dirty. The election between presidential candidates John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson was nasty and bitter, and it involved extreme accusations. John Quincy Adams accused Andrew Jackson of murder while serving as a military officer. Andrew Jackson accused John Quincy Adams of having been a pimp while serving as a diplomat in Russia. Lurid accusations circulated by handbill and in partisan newspapers. Handbills were basically the small magazines of their time. Jackson won the election in 1828, and his administration got out to a bitter beginning when Adams refused to attend his inauguration. You can look it up online. I've seen the picture. It's the front page, what they call the top half of the fold. And a huge, you got to remember, this is 1820s. So when you call somebody something or accusations concerning women, it's a lot more big of a deal than it is today. In giant, big, bold print, the word whore. W-H-O-R-E with exclamation points. And it was concerning Jackson's wife. My understanding was that Mrs. Jackson was married prior to being married to the president. But she had thought, I should say, that she was divorced. Come to find out, her lawyer didn't file the necessary paperwork, and technically she wasn't divorced yet. And she thought she was, and she turned around and married Andrew Jackson, which made her a polygamist, which made her a whore. And it was just dirty. And that was some of the nicer things that were done. It was bad. The two opponents' election of 1828 had faced each other before in the election of 1824. A peculiar affair which had been known as the Krupp bargain. Yeah, peculiar affair. Corrupt. Sound familiar? In 1824, a race had to be decided in the House of Representatives. It was widely believed that Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, had used his considerable influence to tilt the victory to John Quincy Adams. Well, we can say the Democrat in this cycle used his influence for other things, which we can't say on YouTube. Jackson's furious campaign against Adams essentially resumed as soon as Adams took office in 1825. His old Hickory and his supporters worked diligently to line up support around the country. Oh, boy. Talk about history repeating itself. While Jackson's natural power base was in the South and among rural voters, oh, boy, does it sound familiar? He managed to align himself with New York political power broker Martin Van Buren. With Van Buren's clever guidance, Jackson was able to fashion an appeal to working people in the North. Well, maybe the current president can find a Martin Van Buren, so to speak, to fashion an appeal. I like that. In 1827, supporters in both Adams and Jackson's camps began concerted efforts to undermine the character of the opponent, even though the two candidates had strong differences on substantial issues. The resulting campaign turned out to be based on personalities, and the tactics employed were outrageously underhanded. Let me repeat that again. Even though the two candidates had strong differences on substantial issues, the resulting campaign turned out to be based on personalities. Just 2 weeks ago, President Obama said that presidential elections, aren't about policies anymore. Man, oh man. Talk about fist and glove. Looks exactly like what's going on now. An 1824 election had been marked by strong party affiliations. During the Adams administration, the defenders of the status quo began calling themselves National Republicans. Their opponents in the Jackson camp began calling themselves Democratic Republicans, which soon shortened to Democrats. The 1828 election was thus a return of the two-party system, with a precursor of the familiar two-party system we know today. The Democrat loyalists of Jackson were organized by a New York smart Martin Van Buren, who was known for his sharp political skills. For those who detested Andrew Jackson, they enlisted a gold mine of material. So, for those who detested Donald Trump, they enlisted a gold mine of material. It's just, you can substitute the names. It's amazing. Jackson was famous for his incendiary temper and had led a life filled with violence and controversy. A life filled with controversy. And he's very outgoing and fairly arrogant. He had taken part in several duels, killing a man in a notorious one in 1806. When commanding troops in 1815, he had ordered the execution of militia members accused of desertion. The severity of the punishment and its shaky legal foundation became part of Jackson's reputation. Those opposed to John Quincy Adams mocked him as an elitist. Oh, boy. Mocked him as an elitist. Refinement and intelligence of Adams, well, that one doesn't apply. Of Adams were turned against him. He was even derided as a Yankee at a time when that noted shopkeepers reputed to take advantage of consumers. Andrew Jackson's reputation as a national hero is based on his military career. He has been the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, the final action of the War of 1812. His military glory was turned against him when a Philadelphia printer named John Binns published a notorious coffin handbill, a poster showing 6 black coffins and claiming the militia Jackson had ordered executed had essentially been murdered. Even Jackson's marriage became fodder for campaign attacks. When Jackson first met his wife Rachel, she mistakenly believed her first husband, who she married as a teenager, had divorced her. So when Jackson married in 1791, she was still legally married. The legal situation of the marriage was eventually resolved, and the Jacksons were married in 1794 to ensure that their marriage was legal. But Jackson's political opponents knew of the confusion. Jackson's marriage in the frontier nearly 40 years earlier became a major issue during the 1828 campaign. He was accused of adultery and vilified for running off with another man's wife. And his wife was accused of bigamy. That's what I mentioned. The newspaper that had giant words, whore, on there concerning Mrs. Jackson. Pretty brutal stuff. I mean, even by today's standards, but back then, it was considered 10 times worse. John Quincy Adams, the son of a founding father and second President John Adams, began his career in public service by working as a secretary to the American envoy to Russia while he was still a teenager. Now, those of you that haven't seen it yet, John Adams, the HBO miniseries, usually I'm not pushing some of these media companies because they got so PC lately, but that was incredibly well made. And I'll be honest with you, John Adams was one of the original founding fathers, second president of the United States, and history has screwed him over. It's like they bypassed him. It's amazing to me because he had a personality very similar to Jackson's, very arrogant, very pushy, stubborn, and people don't like presidents that are like that, I guess. I don't know. But John Adams was screwed over by historians, in my personal opinion. He had an illustrious career as a diplomat, which formed the basis for his later career in politics. The supporters of Andrew Jackson began spreading a rumor that Adams, while serving as an American ambassador to Russia, had procured an American girl for the sexual services of the Russian Tsar. The attack was no doubt baseless, but the Jacksonians delighted in it, even calling Adams a pimp and claiming that procuring women explained his great success as a diplomat. Nice. Adams was also attacked for having a billiards table in the White House and allegedly charged the government for it. It was true that Adams played billiards in the White House, but he paid for the table with his own funds. As the scurrilous charges appeared in the papers of partisan newspapers, John Quincy Adams reacted by refusing to get involved with the campaign tactics. He He was so offended by what was happening that he even refused to write in the pages of his diary from August 1828 until after the election. In all fairness, I never was a big fan of John Quincy. I liked his father a lot more. But he did screw over Andrew Jackson. He did do it. I understand it's ambition, and he thought he would be the better president. I get all that, but he had this coming to him, to be honest with you. Jackson, on the other hand, was so furious about the attacks on himself and his wife, he got more involved. This sounds familiar. He wrote to newspaper editors giving them guidelines on how attacks should be countered and how their own attacks should proceed. Well, i.e. Twitter. Jackson won the election of 1828. Jackson's appeal to the common folk served him well, and he handily won the popular vote and the electoral vote. It came at a price, however. His wife Rachel suffered a heart attack and died before the inauguration, and Jackson always blamed his political enemies for her death. When Jackson arrived in Washington for his inauguration, he refused to pay the customary courtesy call on the outgoing president. And John Quincy Adams reciprocated by refusing to attend the inauguration of Jackson. Indeed, the bitterness of the election of 1828 resonated for years. Jackson, it can be said, was angry the day he became president, and he stayed angry. And there's something about, especially at high-level politics or high-level business or even love interest for that matter, when you feel like you've been screwed over and the majority of people agree with it and everybody you know agrees with it, it gives you that extra power, so to speak, mentally and physically, to right that wrong, that you have to go after the person that screwed you over. And Jackson certainly did. And I'm doing this episode because I see so many parallels between the current situation and Jackson Adams' situation. So there you go, folks. Do some research. It's very interesting. Jackson was a very complicated man, but like all people, not perfect. He had his faults. He had his personality quirks, just like the current president. And John Quincy Adams, even though a great intellect, I felt he wasted his shot by making that deal. And he was a congressman for a long time. And those of you that don't remember, he was one of the lawyers in the famous Amistad case. That's where they made the movie out of and kind of bent history a little bit, but it's basically about blacks that were taken from Africa when slave trading was outlawed and they were run through Cuba, and they later killed the crew, and they went on trial for murder. And John Quincy Adams was one of the lawyers later in his life. And I did do an episode where it's a very interesting quote. I know it's in the movie. I couldn't get the quote from his 3 or 4 hour dissertation of the trial, but basically what he said was, if the Amistad Africans are found not guilty, people are afraid it will cause a civil war. And if it does cause a civil war, let it come. And let it finally be the last battle of the American Revolution. So we've got very strong personalities and really important parts in our history, titans clashing. And sometimes it's a mess. And that's just the way it is. So do some research on these two. I think you'll find it fascinating. Anyway, folks, that's it for now. And until the next time, goodbye and good luck.